What if your whole existence, your destiny, your well-being, and even your mind were predetermined before you were born, just because your ancestors were fixated on preserving the purity of their bloodline for countless generations? Royal dynasties throughout the world engaged in a chilling bargain. They risked genetic disorders in exchange for maintaining political dominance. The outcome was often shattered minds, deteriorated bodies, and family trees so twisted they defied recognition. Today, we explore the heart-wrenching, unbelievable, and at times deeply disturbing tales of history's most inbred women. And by the time we reach the top story, you will be absolutely amazed. Beginning at number 10 is Elizabeth II of Spain, who reigned from 1833 to 1868. Her life was not defined by glory, but by the harsh consequences of centuries of intermarriage. Born in 1830, Elizabeth's birth as a daughter was oddly celebrated after her father's long and desperate wish for a male successor. But happiness was fleeting. From the start, both her health and that of her sister caused quiet anxiety. It is no secret that her birth was the result of a marriage between an uncle and his niece. The family tree grows even more tangled. Her grandparents on one side were at the same time her great-grandparents on the other, creating a true maze of relationships. At the age of 16, Elizabeth was wed to her double second cousin. She had 11 children, but tragically only 5 survived infancy. Here matters become more intricate. Many scholars contend that her spouse fathered none of those surviving offspring, and their marriage was enveloped in mystery. Possibly affected by personal and perhaps unspoken realities regarding her husband's true identity, Elizabeth II eventually lost her crown, yet her legacy endures, deeply intertwined with the hidden struggles of her family's genetic entanglements. At number 9, we encounter Mary Louise of Austria, born into one of Europe's most intricately connected royal lineages. Her parents were double first cousins, sharing both sets of grandparents in a family where cousin marriages were common rather than unusual. Tragedy struck frequently, as out of 12 children only 7 survived to adulthood. The degree of inbreeding in her ancestry is astonishing. From a genetic standpoint, Mary Louise had just 4 unique great-grandparents, half the typical amount. This level of genetic concentration is something scientists today observe mainly in close-knit, isolated groups. At the age of 18, Mary Louise was married off to none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, her father's former adversary. This union was a strategic political decision aimed at establishing peace and ensuring a male successor. For Mary Louise, it also meant bearing the immense responsibility of an empire on her young shoulders. At number 8, we leave behind lavish royal courts and enter the grim realities of a small American town. Laura Walker's story illustrates that the consequences of intense inbreeding are not confined to distant history. They persist even in modern times. Documented in a well-known film, the Walker family has become a notable example of what happens when generations endure isolation and restricted genetic variety. Unchecked intermarriage leads to troubling outcomes, with Laura Walker standing out as a haunting example. Known as one of the most genetically intertwined individuals in recent times, she is also the mother of Tommy Walker, who is often considered among the most genetically impacted people alive today. Their story is disturbing not simply for its shock factor, but because it reminds us that this is not just royal lore. It is a human saga replaying itself quietly in secluded parts of the world. At number 7, we have Mary the Fair of Portugal, also called Mary the Pious by some, while others find Mary the Troubled a more accurate description. Born in 1734, her existence was marked by growing mental challenges and a family tree burdened by far too many royal unions that were uneasily close. Her parents, King Joseph the Great of Portugal and Mary Anne of Spain, represented the 16th Royal Iberian pair, tightly linked through close intermarriage. Yet that was only part of the tale. Mary herself, pressed to uphold the family legacy, made a decision that defined her story. She wed her own uncle. The results were as sorrowful as they were foreseeable. Half of her children did not survive, with genetic defects likely playing a significant part. As she grew older, Mary's mental health declined, eventually declaring her unable to govern. Her narrative reveals royalty undone not by warfare or rebellion, but by the unseen burden of repeated genetic patterns. Number 6 introduces us to the tragic journey of Mary Louise Elizabeth Dorian, whose life resembles a Gothic tale penned by fate itself. Born into a deeply troubled royal family, Elizabeth II entered a life marked by blood and suffering. Her father was compelled to marry his own cousin, an illegitimate daughter of King Louis XIV. As the eldest surviving child of this union, Mary Louise had little control over her fate. She was later wed to another cousin, Prince Charles Barry, resulting in 3 offspring who tragically did not survive infancy. Whether the devastating effects were due to relentless inbreeding or some other cruel twist of fate, history remains uncertain. What is clear is that Mary Louise turned to alcohol at a shockingly young age, with reports suggesting as early as 14. Was this a silent plea for help, or a method to endure the harsh realities imposed upon her? Regardless, her story remains a heart-rending example of dynastic responsibility gone terribly wrong. At the 5th position, we encounter a less renowned but equally intriguing royal figure, Princess Alexia of Greece, born in the year 1965. Her life represents a link between the waning custom of royal marriages and the lasting consequences of aristocratic inbreeding. Alongside her 4 siblings, she was born from one of the last notable unions between a reigning king and a royal princess. However, this marriage was more complex than mere romantic tales often portray. Her parents, Queen Anne-Marie of Denmark and King Constantine II of Greece, were connected by blood in multiple ways. They were not only second cousins, but also third cousins, creating a complex double bond that was as much political as it was familial. Their genealogies were intricately intertwined and burdened with deep ties. Constantine's great-grandparents were siblings. One of his grandmothers was also the sister of his great-grandfather. Anne-Marie's lineage bore its own complex heritage, although their union seemed affectionate. Their close genetic connections meant that their offspring, including Alexia, were partially inbred just like the famously connected British royals Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. This is a modern royal story grounded in a deeply rooted tradition. Coming in at the 4th place is a figure whose name seldom appears despite her remarkable genetic background. Mary Antonia of Austria, a Habsburg, went beyond even her notorious uncle King Joseph the Great in terms of inbreeding. While King Joseph is frequently regarded as the prime example of the Habsburgs' genetic troubles, Mary Antonia's family history makes his seem straightforward. Her ancestry was not a simple tree, but more like a thick, winding vine filled with repeated names and recurring marriages. Some have described it as a genetic circle instead of a standard lineage. The level of her inbreeding was so extreme that her genetic closeness resembled that of a child born from 2 full siblings. Yet her narrative often remains in the background. History might have neglected her name, but from a genetic perspective she stood at the highest point of Habsburg inbreeding, a quiet yet unforgettable character in this prolonged and intricate saga. Looking much further into the past, number 3 brings us to a pair of enigmatic individuals forgotten by many. Identified only by the numbers Mummies 317A and 317B, these girls never had the chance to rule, yet their preserved remains reveal a story filled with ancient grief and genetic consequence. These 2 infants were likely stillborn daughters of none other than Pharaoh Tutankhamun and his wife Anasaon, born approximately 1,300 years before the Common Era. But here is the chilling fact. Anasaon was not only Tutankhamun's queen, but also his half-sister, sharing the same father. This continued a long-standing royal tradition of sibling marriage in Egypt's ruling family. Tutum himself was the product of generations of closely related bloodlines. By the time his daughters were conceived, the genetic risks had reached a tragic extreme. Their brief lives, marked by deformities and vulnerability, stand as haunting evidence that even gods among men were not immune to the harsh reality of inbreeding. At the second point in our story, we shift from ancient royalty to a deeply unsettling modern case in Australia. This is not a royal saga, but it exposes some of the darkest outcomes of unchecked inbreeding in recent times. Kimberly Colt's family, known to the public by a pseudonym, became the focus of one of the most shocking genetic and legal investigations of the early 2000s. Living in severe isolation, this Colt family engaged in multi-generational inbreeding, creating a closed community with almost no genetic outside influence. When the truth was revealed, authorities stepped in, uncovering disturbing and complex layers of abuse and genetic hardship that reflected the devastating consequences of long-term isolation and restricted gene pools. A tangled network that resulted in numerous police investigations and arrests. Kimberly, born into this setting, stands as one of the most genetically affected individuals ever recorded. Her story is not about royal expectations or ancestral pride, but serves as a contemporary demonstration of how isolation combined with the absence of supervision can lead to devastating human consequences. At the forefront of this narrative is Elizabeth II, Cleopatra II, Philopator, a woman who more than anybody else symbolized the full impact of deliberate inbreeding aimed at securing political dominance. Forget the romanticized image of Cleopatra often portrayed in movies. This Cleopatra was far from a mythical character. She represented the very essence of dynastic fixation. Although Egyptian by title, her lineage was entirely Greek-Macedonian, descending from the Ptolemaic dynasty, which relentlessly engaged in sibling and uncle-niece unions to keep power both concentrated and pure. Cleopatra II's parents were siblings, her grandparents were also siblings, and her own siblings married each other before she ultimately ruled on her own. She stood as a living testament to the tactic of preserving bloodlines. While powerful, she carried a heavy genetic burden. Even her name, borrowed from a rare Syrian princess, was one of the scarce indications that any outsider had ever entered the family tree. Cleopatra II was not merely a royal figure, she embodied the genetic result of generations of tightly interwoven ancestry, a formidable ruler whose biology reflected the immense weight of a family's deliberate ambition. From magnificent palaces to forgotten hamlets, her story echoes the consequences of such intense lineage manipulation. From shining crowns to distant seclusion, the quest for purity, authority, and heritage has altered the narratives of these women into accounts of sorrow, endurance, and enlightenment. Their experiences serve as a reminder that history is frequently influenced not solely by governance or conflict, but by the unseen forces of genetics and lineage.